The Obsidian Heights Grand Ballroom was a cathedral of excess, a shimmering monument to the kind of wealth that didn't just talk, it roared. Gold leaf clung to the intricate moldings of the ceiling and crystal chandeliers, each large enough to crush a mid-sized sedan, cast a relentless, glittering light over a sea of silk, satin, and diamonds. The floor was a polished expanse of white Italian marble, so reflective that it seemed to double the opulence of the room. Elias Thorne stood near the perimeter of the dance floor, his hands clasped firmly behind his back, a silver tray of vintage champagne balanced with the practiced grace of a man who had spent his life under the weight of much heavier things. He was 32 years old, though the fine lines around his eyes and the stillness in his posture suggested a much older soul. His black vest was tied across his broad shoulders, a clearance rack find that pinched in all the wrong places, and his shoes were a size too small, a dull ache radiating from his toes to his lower back. To the people in this room, Elias was not a man. He was a fixture. He was the invisible hand that replenished a flute, the silent shadow that cleared an abandoned plate. He was part of the architecture, no more significant than the velvet curtains or the gilded pillars. He didn't mind the invisibility. In fact, he relied on it. As a former army sergeant who had served 2 grueling tours in arid, hostile lands, Elias had learned that the less attention you drew, the longer you survived. But survival in the civilian world was a different kind of war. It was a war of bills, of leaking pipes in a cramped apartment, and of the crushing realization that his daughter, Maya, was growing out of her shoes for the 3rd time in a single year. His day job at the industrial warehouse paid the rent, barely. These weekend gigs at the Grand Hotel were the only thing keeping the lights on and the pediatrician's bills from going to collections. Maya had been getting headaches lately, and the doctor wanted to run tests that cost more than Elias made in a month of lifting crates. So he stood in his tight vest. He smiled when a guest looked his way, and he ignored the throbbing in his feet. "Excuse me, boy." A woman in a dress the color of a bruised plum thrust an empty glass toward him. She didn't look at his face. She was too busy scrolling through her phone, her thumb flicking past images of other wealthy people at other wealthy parties. "Of course, ma'am," Elias said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He took the glass and began his trek back toward the service doors. As he moved through the crowd, the snippets of conversation were always the same. Market fluctuations, summer homes in the Hamptons, the latest social scandals. But tonight, a new name was circulating through the room like a localized storm. "Did you hear? The Sterling girl is actually here." "Serafina? You're joking." "I thought she'd become a complete recluse after the accident." "Apparently, her father insisted. It's the family foundation's gala, after all. But look at her, hidden away in the VIP section like a ghost." Elias paused by a dessert table, clearing away discarded napkins. He had heard the name Sterling before. Everyone in the city knew the Sterling real estate empire. They owned half the skyline. But he didn't care about society gossip. He had enough ghosts of his own. "Such a tragedy," another woman whispered, her voice dripping with the kind of pity that felt more like an insult. "They say the scar is horrific. She won't even look in a mirror. Can you imagine? To go from being the golden girl to that." Elias moved away, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He hated the way they talked about her, like she was a broken piece of furniture that had lost its value. He knew what it was like to be viewed through the lens of damage. He had shrapnel scars on his thigh and a soul that sometimes felt like it had been put through a shredder, but at least he could hide his wounds beneath a cheap suit. "Thorne," a sharp voice hissed in his ear. Elias turned to see Martha, the head of catering, her face a mask of frantic stress. She was a woman who lived in a state of perpetual near collapse, fueled by espresso and the fear of a bad review. "They need more servers in the elevated tier. The Sterling table. Now," she ordered. "And Elias? Be careful. Mrs. Sterling is particular. Don't stare. Don't talk unless spoken to. Just keep the glasses full and act like you aren't there." "Understood," Elias said. He followed Martha toward the back of the ballroom, where a roped-off section sat 3 steps above the rest of the floor. 2 security guards, men who looked like they were carved out of granite, stood at the entrance. They checked Elias's ID with suspicious eyes before stepping aside. The VIP section was a different world. The noise of the ballroom was dampened. Here, replaced by the soft clink of fine silver and the hushed tones of power. There were only 4 tables, and at the center one sat the Sterling family. Julian Sterling, the patriarch, was a man with silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than Elias's car. Beside him was Eleanor Sterling, a woman whose face was so tightly pulled by plastic surgery that she looked like she was perpetually bracing for an impact. And between them sat Serafina. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, but she sat with her shoulders hunched, her head tilted down. A curtain of thick, dark hair was carefully arranged to fall over the left side of her face. She was wearing a midnight blue gown that shimmered with every shallow breath she took, but she seemed to be trying to shrink into the fabric. She was beautiful, but it was a beauty haunted by a profound, echoing stillness. "You're the new one?" Eleanor Sterling's eyes snapped to Elias as he approached, with a fresh bottle of champagne. "Elias Thorne, ma'am. I'll be attending to your table this evening." Eleanor hummed, a sound of dismissive appraisal. "Fine. See that you don't spill anything. This silk is irreplaceable." Elias bowed his head slightly and took his position a few paces behind the table. He became a statue. He watched the ballroom, his military training, keeping him alert. He saw the way the guests looked up at the Sterling table, the curiosity, the morbid fascination, the way they tried to catch a glimpse of what Serafina was hiding. For an hour, the evening proceeded in a blur of speeches and silent auctions. Serafina hadn't spoken a single word. She hadn't touched her food. She simply stared at the tablecloth, her hand occasionally drifting to the hair covering. Her face, a nervous, repetitive gesture. Around 10 p.m., the atmosphere changed. 3 men in their late 20s, their faces flushed with expensive bourbon and unearned confidence, ascended the steps to the VIP tier. The leader was a man named Alistair Vance. Elias recognized him from the tabloids, the son of a banking magnate, a man who had never faced a consequence in his life. "Julian, Eleanor, splendid event," Alistair boomed, his voice cutting through the refined air like a jagged blade. He shook Julian's hand with a swagger that made Elias's jaw tighten. "Alistair, good of you to join us," Julian said, though his voice lacked any real warmth. Alistair's eyes turned to Serafina. A predatory, cruel glint appeared in them. "And Serafina, it's been ages. Still hiding behind that hair, I see. You know, people are starting to think you've grown a second head under there." Serafina didn't move, but Elias saw her fingers clench the fabric of her dress until her knuckles turned white. "Alistair, that's enough," Eleanor said, though her tone was more annoyed by the breach of etiquette than protective of her daughter. "Oh, come on, Eleanor. We're all friends here." Serafina and I were practically engaged before the unpleasantness. Alistair leaned in, closer to Serafina, dropping his voice just enough that it felt intimate and violating at the same time. "I did you a favor, you know, breaking things off. Can you imagine the photos? The Beauty and the Beast headlines." His friends chuckled behind him, a sycophantic, ugly sound. The air in the VIP section seemed to freeze. Julian Sterling looked away, his jaw working as if he were trying to swallow his pride. Eleanor adjusted her pearls. No one moved. No one spoke. Elias felt something inside him snap. It wasn't a loud noise, but a quiet, tectonic shift. He had seen bullies like Alistair his entire life, men who thought that because they had never bled, they were invincible. He thought of Maya, whom he was teaching to be brave. He thought of Captain Miller, who had died in a dusty valley in Hellman to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. He didn't think about his job. He didn't think about the rent. Elias stepped forward. His hand, calloused and steady, clamped onto Alistair Vance's shoulder. He didn't squeeze hard enough to bruise, but he squeezed hard enough to make the younger man gasp. "I believe the lady asked you to leave," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the flat, lethal quality of a bayonet. Alistair spun around, his face turning a mottled red. Who the hell do you think you are? Get your hands off me, you peasant. I'm the person telling you that you've overstayed your welcome, Elias replied. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. He stood his ground like a mountain. Do you have any idea who my father is? Alistair hissed. I don't care if your father is the King of England, Elias said. You're a man who doesn't know how to speak to a lady. And in my world, that makes you a coward. The entire ballroom seemed to go silent. The music played on, but the heads near the VIP section were all turned. The two security guards were already moving, their faces set in grim lines. Thorn, what are you doing? Martha appeared at the edge of the tier, her face white with terror. Security reached Elias, grabbing his arms. He didn't resist. He allowed them to pull his hands away from Alistair, but his eyes stayed locked on the younger man, until Alistair looked away, visibly shaken. I apologize for the disturbance, Elias said, looking directly at Serafina. She was staring at him, her eyes wide, her hand frozen near her face. For the first time, she wasn't looking at the floor. She was looking at him. Get him out of here, Julian Sterling barked, finally finding his voice. Martha, I want this man blacklisted from every agency in the city. Elias was marched toward the exit. He felt the weight of every eye in the room. He felt the cold realization that he had just destroyed his life. Tomorrow, there would be no extra money for Maya's shoes. There would be no tests for her headaches. He would be lucky if he kept his warehouse job once the Sterlings made a phone call. They reached the grand lobby, the marble cool and indifferent. Martha was screaming at him, a frantic, high-pitched noise about unprofessionalism and ruined reputations. You're fired, Thorn. You won't see a dime for tonight. And don't you dare show your face at this hotel again. Elias just nodded. He felt a strange, quiet peace. He had done what was right. In a world of gold and glass, he had remembered what it meant to be a man. He was halfway to the revolving doors when a voice rang out, echoing off the high ceilings. Wait. Everyone stopped. Elias turned. Serafina Sterling was standing at the entrance of the ballroom. She was breathing hard, her hair disheveled, falling away from her face. The scar was visible now, a jagged, silver line that ran from her temple, across her cheek, and down to her jaw. It was a mark of violence, of survival. It didn't make her ugly. It made her look like she had been forged in fire. She walked across the lobby, her heels clicking with a sharp, determined rhythm. She ignored Martha. She ignored the security guards. She walked straight up to Elias. Why did you do that? She asked. Her voice was trembling, but it was clear. Because he was wrong, Elias said. And because no one else was going to say it. You lost your job. I've lost more for less, Elias replied. Serafina studied his face. She looked at his cheap vest, his scuffed shoes, and the steady, unbreakable light in his eyes. She turned to Martha. How much were you going to pay him for tonight? Martha stammered. Well, the shift was $12 an hour plus tips, but he's no longer your employee, Serafina said. She pulled a phone from a small clutch bag. Her fingers moved with a sudden, fierce grace. I've just transferred $5,000 to this hotel's events account. That covers his wages, his tips, and the distress he caused your guest. Martha's jaw dropped. The security guards loosened their grip on Elias's arms. Serafina looked back at Elias. Mr. Thorn, I find I am in need of someone I can trust this evening. The atmosphere inside is suffocating. Would you accompany me back to the gala? Not as a server, as my guest. Elias looked at her. He thought of his car, his leaking roof, and his sleeping daughter. He thought of the world he came from and the world she lived in. I'm not dressed for it, ma'am, he said softly. Serafina reached out and took his hand. Her palm was small and warm against his calloused skin. Neither am I, she said, her eyes meeting his. I'm wearing a mask I'm tired of carrying. Will you help me take it off? Elias Thorn, the man who had survived war and poverty, felt a different kind of fear spike through him, the fear of a new beginning. He looked at the woman who had lived in shadows, and he saw a kindred spirit. I'm not a very good dancer, he admitted. Serafina almost smiled. A real, honest-to-God smile. I've had enough of good dancers, Mr. Thorn. I'd rather have someone who knows how to stand his ground. As the orchestra inside began a slow, sweeping waltz, Elias Thorne took the hand of the billionaire heiress. Together, they turned away from the lobby and walked back into the light. The choice had been made. The life he knew was over, and the one he never dared to dream of was just beginning. And as he stepped back onto that marble floor, Elias Thorne knew one thing for certain. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was alive. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open, and for the second time that night, a profound silence rippled through the Obsidian Heights Grand Hotel. It was a silence not born of respect, but of absolute, collective shock. Serafina Sterling, the girl who had been whispered about like a tragic legend for 3 years, was walking back into the light. And she wasn't alone. Clinging to her hand was the man who, moments ago, had been physically removed from the premises, the waiter in the ill-fitting vest and the pinched shoes. Elias Thorne could feel the heat of 1,000 stares. It was a different kind of heat than the dry, blistering sun of the Kandahar province, but it made his skin prickle with the same sense of imminent danger. In his world, when people looked at you this way, it was usually right before a firefight. He adjusted his posture, his spine straightening into a rigid military line. He might be wearing a cheap uniform of service, but he stood with the quiet authority of a man who had led men through hell. "Don't look at them," Serafina whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden, frantic murmur of the crowd. "Look at me." Elias looked. Without the curtain of hair, her face was a map of a life interrupted. The scar was thick and jagged, a silvery contrast to the creaminess of her skin. To the elite gathered in the room, it was a flaw. To Elias, who had seen the way metal and fire tore through flesh, it was a badge of resilience. She was still here. She had survived. "The music is starting again," she said, her brown eyes searching his. "They're waiting for a spectacle. Let's give them a dance instead." Elias felt a surge of panic. "Serafina, I told you. I don't know how to do this. I'm a sergeant, not a socialite. My idea of a coordinated movement involves a 3-man fire team." A small, genuine spark of amusement lit her eyes. "It's just a box step, Elias. I'll lead. Just don't let me fall." "Never," he said, and the word came out with the weight of an oath. As they stepped onto the marble floor, the orchestra, perhaps signaled by a frantic Julian Sterling or a confused conductor, began a sweeping, melancholic waltz. The other couples parted like a retreating tide, leaving a vast, shimmering circle for the unlikely pair. Elias placed his hand on her waist. She was delicate, almost fragile, but there was a tension in her muscles that told him she was fighting a war of her own, just to stay standing. He took her other hand, his calloused palm swallowing hers. They began to move. For the first few bars, it was clumsy. Elias stepped on the toe of her silk slipper, his face flushing with a rare heat. "Sorry," he muttered. "Keep going," she urged. "They're watching for us to fail. Don't give them the satisfaction." He tightened his grip slightly, providing the steady anchor she clearly needed. He stopped thinking about the steps and started thinking about the rhythm. It was like patrolling at night. You didn't look at your feet, you felt the ground and sensed the movement of the person beside you. "You're doing it," she breathed. As they rotated through the center of the room, the whispers grew into a dull roar. Elias ignored them, focusing entirely on the woman in his arms. "Why did you really come back out there?" he asked, his voice low so only she could hear. "You could have let them take me away. It would have been easier for you." "I've been taking the easy way for 3 years," Serafina said, her gaze drifting to a point somewhere over his shoulder. "Hiding, covering my face, letting my parents tell the world I was recovering when I was actually just disappearing. When you grabbed Alistair, it was the first time in years I saw someone act without calculating the social cost. You didn't care about his father or my family's money. You just saw someone being cruel, and you stopped. It's what I was trained to do," Elias said simply. "No," she countered, looking back at him. "It's who you are. There's a difference." They danced in silence for a moment, the music swelling around them. The Judgmental glares of the wealthy seemed to fade into a blur of color and light. Can I ask? Elias said. The accident. Was it as bad as they say? Serafina's expression darkened. It was raining. 3 years ago. I was driving. Back from a charity board meeting, something I didn't even want to go to. A kid, in a sports car, texting his girlfriend, crossed the median. He hit me head on. My car flipped twice. The doctor said it was a miracle I survived it all. But when I woke up and saw what the glass had done, my mother's first words weren't about my life. They were about the surgeons. She was already mourning. The face of the daughter she wanted to show off. Elias felt a familiar, cold anger. People are idiots. Scars aren't a tragedy. Serafina, they're proof that the world tried to break you and failed. She missed a step, her breath catching. She looked at him with a raw, searching intensity. You really believe that, don't you? I have to, Elias said. I've buried brothers who didn't get the chance to have scars. I've got a few of my own beneath this vest. They don't make me less of a man. They remind me I'm still in the fight. The waltz ended with a final, dramatic flourish of violins. For a second, the room remained silent, and then a smattering of polite, confused applause broke out. It was performative. The elite didn't know how else to react to a Sterling heiress dancing with a servant. They were approached immediately by Julian Sterling. His face was a mask of controlled fury, his eyes darting to the phones he knew were recording every second of this encounter. Serafina, that's enough, Julian said, his voice a sharp hiss. You've made your point. This man has been paid. It's time for him to leave and for you to return to the table. He has a name, Father, Serafina said, her voice steadier than Elias had ever heard it. And he's staying as my guest. He is a waiter, Eleanor Sterling added, appearing at her husband's side, her voice trembling with indignation. Think of the reputation of this foundation. Serafina, this gala is an honor of heroes, not people like this. Elias felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but before he could speak, his eyes drifted to a large oil painting hanging behind the Sterlings. It was a portrait of a man in a dress uniform, a captain in the United States Army. He had Julian's chin but a much kinder set to his eyes. Elias froze. The name on the brass plaque beneath the portrait was one he hadn't seen in years, though he saw the man's face every time he closed his eyes in a darkroom. Captain Andrew Sterling. Andrew, Elias whispered, the word escaping him before he could stop it. Julian Sterling stiffened. How do you know that name? Elias didn't answer him. He looked at Serafina, then back at the portrait. The pieces of a fractured past began to click into place with the force of a hammer. Captain Sterling was your brother? Elias asked Julian. He was, Julian said, his voice tightening. He was a hero who died for this country 10 years ago. This foundation was built in his memory, which is why having you, a common laborer, disturb this event is an insult to everything he stood for. Elias felt a strange, hollow laugh rise in his chest. He reached into the small, hidden pocket of his vest, his fingers brushing against a piece of fabric he carried every single day. He pulled it out. It was a simple, white handkerchief, now yellowed with age, with the initials AS embroidered in the corner. It was stained with a faint, rusty brown that no amount of washing could ever truly remove. You think I'm an insult to his memory? Elias said, his voice dropping into a register that made the security guards take a half step back. I served under Captain Sterling in the 10th Mountain Division. During my second tour, our convoy was ambushed in the Arghandab Valley. My vehicle was hit by an RPG. I was pinned, bleeding out, the engine block on fire. The Sterling stared at him, frozen. Your brother, the man in that painting, didn't ask about my reputation. He didn't check my bank account. He ran through a hail of gunfire, pulled me out of that wreckage, and used this handkerchief to tie a tourniquet on my leg. He stayed with me in the dirt, shielding me with his own body until the medevac arrived. Elias took a step toward Julian, holding the handkerchief out. 2 days later, he went back out on a patrol I was supposed to be on. He hit an IED. He died so I could come home and be a father. So don't you ever tell me that a man who works for a living is an insult to Andrew Sterling. He was the one who taught me that a person's worth is measured by what they do when the world is burning, not by the labels on their suit. Serafina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears began to track down her cheeks, cutting paths through the shimmering makeup. Julian Sterling looked like he had been struck. He stared at the handkerchief, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The hero he had used as a social shield for a decade had just been humanized by the very man he had tried to throw out. The silence this time was different. It was heavy with the weight of unpayable debts. But the moment was shattered by a commotion at the far end of the ballroom. Dad! Dad! The sound of a child's voice, shrill and desperate, cut through the high society atmosphere. Elias turned, his heart leaping into his throat. Running across the marble floor was a 9-year-old girl in a faded purple hoodie and jeans with holes in the knees. Her hair was a wild nest of curls, and her face was streaked with dirt and tears. Following behind her was an elderly, panicked woman, Mrs. Miller, Elias's neighbor. Maya, Elias shouted, moving toward her. The crowd parted in a different way now, not in shock, but in a kind of disgusted confusion, as if a stray dog had wandered into a cathedral. Maya launched herself at Elias, her small arms wrapping around his waist with enough force to stagger him. Dad, Mrs. Miller showed me. She said you were on the phone video, and everyone was being mean. I thought you were hurt. Elias knelt, pulling her into a fierce embrace, ignoring the hundreds of cameras now clicking away. I'm okay, Maya. I'm okay. What are you doing here? You were supposed to be asleep. I saw the video, Elias. Mrs. Miller panted, catching up to them, her face flushed. It's gone viral. Someone live-streamed you grabbing that Vance boy. The comments, they were saying you were going to be arrested. Maya was inconsolable. I didn't know what else to do. Elias looked around. He saw the phones. He saw the predatory grins of the guests, who were already typing out headlines. Waiter veteran scuffles with billionaire. Maya pulled back, looking at her father, then at the elegant woman standing behind him. She blinked, her eyes widening. Are you the princess? Maya asked, her voice dropping into a whisper of awe. Serafina knelt down, her blue silk gown pooling on the floor, indifferent to the dirt Maya had brought in. I'm Serafina, she said softly. You're the princess from the dance, Maya said, reaching out to touch Serafina's hair. But you're sad. My dad says brave people are usually sad because they have to carry more than everyone else. Serafina's breath hitched. She looked at Elias, then back at the little girl. Your dad is a very wise man, Maya. Maya reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a crayon drawing, 2 stick figures under a yellow sun, holding hands. I made this for Dad to give to the princess, because I thought you might be lonely in this big house. Serafina took the drawing as if it were a holy relic. She looked at the stick figures, then at the scar-faced heiress in the mirror of the ballroom wall. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't look away from her own reflection. Thank you, Maya, Serafina whispered. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. The Sterlings moved in then, Julian looking recovered and Eleanor looking like she was about to faint. This is an outrage, Eleanor hissed. Security, remove these people immediately. This is a private event, not a playground. No. The word was quiet, but it carried the finality of a closing door. Serafina stood up, holding Maya's drawing in one hand and Elias's hand in the other. If they go, I go, Serafina said. Serafina, don't be absurd, Julian warned. You have nowhere to go. I have the penthouse my grandfather left me, she replied. The one you've been trying to get me to sell for years. And I have the Sterling name, which, as of tonight, I am going to use to tell the truth about what happened to Andrew. And what's happening in this room? She looked at Elias. Mr. Thorne, I believe we are done here. I've had quite enough of gold and crystal for one lifetime. Ms. Sterling, Elias said, glancing at his daughter. I need to get Maya home. She has school tomorrow, and I have to figure out how to find a new job. You have a job, Serafina said. If you'll have it. I need someone to help me run the Andrew Sterling Foundation, not as a figurehead, but as someone who actually knows what veterans need. And I think Maya could use some better Shoes. Elias looked at her, stunned. I don't need your charity, Serafina. It's not charity, she said, her eyes flashing with that newfound fire. It's an investment in a hero who's still alive. She leaned in, her voice dropping. And Elias? I'm still not a very good dancer. I was wondering if maybe you'd be willing to try again? Somewhere with fewer cameras. Elias looked down at Maya, who was beaming, then at Serafina, who was finally standing tall. He thought of the handkerchief in his pocket and the man who had died so he could have this moment. Sunday, Elias said. I make pancakes on Sundays. It's a Thorne family tradition, if you're not too busy for a 3-story walk-up in the Bronx. Serafina smiled, and this time, it reached all the way to her soul. 10 a.m. And Elias? I like chocolate chips in mine. As Elias Thorne walked out of the Obsidian Heights Grand Hotel, carrying his daughter in his arms and walking beside the most powerful woman in the city, he didn't feel like a waiter or a servant. He felt like the man Captain Andrew Sterling had saved him to be. The echoes of the past had led him here, and for the first time in a decade, the future didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like home. The morning after the gala, the sun rose over the Bronx not with a shimmer of gold, but with the gray, industrial persistence of a city that never stopped to mourn or marvel. Elias Thorne sat at his small kitchen table, the linoleum chipped at the edges, staring at his smartphone. The screen was a chaotic battlefield of notifications. The video was everywhere. On social media, it had been edited, captioned, and remixed 10,000 times. Hero waiter puts billionaire bully in his place. The Sterling heiress finds her knight. The handkerchief of honor. By 8 a.m., the view count across all platforms had surpassed 50 million. Elias rubbed his face, the stubble on his jaw rasping against his palm. He felt less like a hero and more like a man who had walked into a minefield with his daughter strapped to his chest. Dad. Maya appeared in the doorway of her tiny bedroom, rubbing her eyes. She was still wearing the faded purple hoodie she'd fallen asleep in. Are the mean people on the phone again? Elias forced a smile, turning the phone face down. Just a lot of noise, Maya. Nothing for you to worry about. Are you ready for some breakfast? Can we have the princess pancakes? She asked, her eyes brightening. The ones with the chocolate chips. Elias's heart sank. He had forgotten. Today was Sunday, the day Serafina Sterling, a woman who lived in a glass fortress in the clouds, was supposed to visit a walk-up apartment where the radiator clanked and the hallway smelled like pine sol and old cabbage. Maya, listen, Elias said, kneeling in front of her. Miss Serafina might be very busy today. People like her, they have complicated lives. If she can't make it, it's not because she doesn't want to see you. It's just a sharp, rhythmic knock at the door cut him off. Elias froze. He stood up slowly, his muscles coiling with the instinct of a soldier. He checked the deadbolt. Through the peephole, he didn't see a mob of reporters or a Sterling family lawyer. He saw a flash of midnight blue wool and a face he had spent the night dreaming about. He opened the door. Serafina stood in the dim, flickering light of the hallway. She wasn't wearing a gown or diamonds. She was in a simple navy coat, dark jeans, and leather boots. Her hair was pulled back into a practical ponytail, exposing the jagged scar on her cheek to the harsh fluorescent hum of the corridor. She held a small box from a bakery and a bag of groceries. I'm 10 minutes early, she said, her voice slightly breathless. The driver wanted to wait downstairs, but I told him I could handle a flight of stairs. You came, Elias said, stepping back to let her in. I told you I would, she replied, her eyes sweeping the cramped living room. She didn't look at the cracked plaster or the mismatched furniture with pity. She looked at the crayon drawings taped to the walls and the neatly folded laundry on the sofa with a strange, quiet longing. Princess, Maya squealed, launching herself at Serafina's knees. Serafina laughed, a bright, silver sound that made the small apartment feel suddenly spacious. Hello, Maya. I brought extra chocolate chips. And some of those fancy blueberries that cost too much but taste like summer. For the next hour, the shadows of the world outside were held at bay by the scent of sizzling batter and the sound of a 9-year-old's laughter. Serafina sat at the tiny table, her knees bumping against the underside, and ate pancakes. With the appetite of someone who hadn't enjoyed a meal in years. She listened to Maya talk about her science project on volcanoes and her favorite books. Elias watched them, a sense of profound peace warring with a growing dread. He knew this was a bubble, and bubbles in the Bronx were prone to popping. The pop came at 10:30 a.m. in the form of a phone call. It wasn't Elias's phone. It was Serafina's. She looked at the screen, and the light in her eyes vanished, replaced by the rigid, haunted look of the girl at the gala. "It's my father." She stepped into the hallway to take it. Elias could hear the muffled vibration of Julian Sterling's voice, loud, commanding, and furious. When she came back in, her face was ashen. "The board of the Sterling Group is holding an emergency session," she said, her hands trembling as she tucked her phone away. "Alistair Vance's father is threatening to pull his family's capital from our upcoming development projects. Unless I issue a public apology and unless you are held accountable for the assault on his son." Elias stood, his jaw tightening. "Accountable how?" "They filed a civil suit, Elias. Aggravated assault and emotional distress. They're claiming you caused Alistair a concussion and permanent psychological trauma." Serafina's voice dripped with disgust. "It's a lie. We all saw what happened. But they have the money to make a lie sound like the truth in a courtroom." "I don't have the money for a lawyer, Serafina," Elias said, his voice flat. "They know that. This isn't about justice. It's about draining me until I disappear." "I won't let that happen," she said fiercely. "But it's worse than that. My father, he told me that if I don't stop seeing you, he will move to have me declared mentally unfit due to the trauma of the accident. He wants to take control of my trust and the Andrew Sterling Foundation. He wants to lock me back in the dark where I won't embarrass him." Maya looked up from her plate, her eyes wide. "Is the mean man trying to take you away?" Serafina knelt beside Maya, taking her small hands. "No one is taking anyone, Maya. I promise. But I have to go deal with some very grumpy grown-ups." Elias walked her to the door. The peace of the morning had evaporated, replaced by the cold, biting wind of reality. "You shouldn't have come here," Elias said softly. "They're going to use this. They'll say I'm manipulating you. They'll say I'm a predator." "Let them say it," Serafina replied, her eyes burning with a defiance he hadn't seen before. "For 3 years, I let them tell my story. I let them say I was a victim, a recluse, a tragedy. Last night, you reminded me that I am Andrew Sterling's niece. I am the daughter of a family that builds things. And I am done being a shadow." She reached out, her fingers grazing his cheek. "Don't go to the warehouse tomorrow, Elias. My father has connections with the parent company that owns your facility. They'll be looking for any excuse to fire you or set you up. I have to work, Serafina. I have a daughter to feed. Come to the foundation office at noon," she said. "I'm calling a press conference. If they want a spectacle, we'll give them one they'll never forget." Monday morning at the warehouse felt like walking into a trap. Elias's co-workers, men he had bled and sweated with for years, looked at him differently. Some gave him a thumbs up, but most looked away, their eyes filled with the nervous energy of people who knew a storm was coming and didn't want to be caught in the rain. Frank, the floor manager and a veteran himself, pulled Elias into his glass-walled office. "Reed, I like you," Frank said, leaning back in his chair. He looked tired. "You're the best worker I've got. But I just got a call from the regional VP. They're asking for your personnel file. They're looking at your behavioral history. They're worried about the liability of having someone with your aggressive tendencies on the floor." "I defended a woman from a harasser, Frank," Elias said. "I know that. You know that. But the people in the tall buildings? They only see a viral video of a warehouse worker putting his hands on a man whose name is on their donor list." Frank sighed, sliding a manila envelope across the desk. "Take your vacation days. All of them. Start today. If you're not on the clock, they can't find a reason to cite you for a safety violation or some other trumped-up charge. Get out of here, Elias. Go fight the fight you need to fight." Elias took the envelope. "Thanks, Frank. Don't thank me. Just win. For all of us who can't talk back to the bastards." Elias left the warehouse, but he didn't go home. He drove to the Andrew Sterling Foundation headquarters, a sleek glass and steel building in Midtown. The lobby was a hive of activity. Reporters were held back by a line of security, guards who looked far more professional than the ones at the hotel. When Elias approached, a woman in a sharp gray suit intercepted him. "Mr. Thorne? I'm Claire, Serafina's personal counsel. Follow me. We don't have much time." He was whisked up to a private floor. Serafina was there, looking like a different person. She was in a tailored white suit, her hair styled in a way that showcased her scar rather than hiding it. She looked like a general, preparing for a siege. "They've leaked a story to the tabloids," she said, handing him a tablet. The headline made Elias's blood boil. "The Scourge of the Sterling Gala. Waiter's Violent Past Revealed." The article detailed his PTSD diagnosis, a minor bar fight from 5 years ago after Maya's mother died, and his financial instability. It painted him as a desperate man looking for a payday. "My father did this," Serafina said, her voice cold. "He thinks that by destroying you, he can make me see reason. He doesn't realize that by attacking you, he's only proving how right I was to leave." "What's the plan?" Elias asked. "The Vance family is holding a press conference at 1 p.m. to announce their lawsuit." Claire, the lawyer, explained. "We're going to preempt them. Serafina is going to announce a major shift in the Foundation's mission, one that focuses on veteran advocacy and workers' rights. And she's going to name you as the Chief of Security and Veteran Outreach." Elias blinked. "Serafina, I'm not qualified for." "You are the most qualified person I know," she interrupted. "You know the struggle. You know the honor. And most importantly, you're the only person who doesn't look at me and see a dollar sign or a scar." The press conference was a blur. Elias stood behind Serafina as she spoke to a sea of flashing lights. She was magnificent. She spoke of her uncle's sacrifice, of the reality of the men and women who served, and of the greed that had infested her family's legacy. "The Sterling Group thinks they can buy silence," she told the cameras. "They think they can use the law to crush those who have less. But the Sterling Foundation belongs to the memory of a man who gave everything for his brothers. Today, we return to those roots." When it was over, the room was in an uproar. Serafina and Elias retreated to a private office. For a moment, the adrenaline faded, leaving them both shaking. "We just declared war," she whispered. "I know," Elias said. He reached out, taking her hand. "But you aren't fighting it alone this time." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Elias's phone. It was Maya's school. "Mr. Thorne?" The principal's voice was frantic. "You need to come to the school immediately. There are men here. They claim to be private investigators working for the Vance family. They're asking Maya questions. They're trying to serve her with papers." The peace shattered. The shadows weren't just following them anymore. They were coming for the only thing Elias had left to lose. "I'm coming," Elias hissed, his voice a low, lethal growl. He looked at Serafina. They went to the school. They went to Maya. Serafina's face transformed. The corporate executive vanished, replaced by a woman who had seen the worst of the world and was done being a victim. "Claire, call the police. Call our security detail," Serafina ordered. She grabbed her coat. "Elias, get in the car. We're going to show them exactly what happens when you threaten a thorn." As they raced toward the Bronx, Elias felt the old, familiar coldness settling over him. It was the feeling he had before a breach, before the doors went down, and the world went loud. The Sterling wealth was a shadow, and the Vance greed was a poison. But Elias Thorne was a soldier, and he was done playing defense. The war had moved to his doorstep, and the shadows were about to learn that some men are more dangerous. In the dark, the drive to the Bronx was a blur of screeching tires and white-knuckled silence. Elias drove the Sterling-issued SUV with the grim focus of a man behind the wheel of a Humvee in a hot zone. Beside him, Serafina was on the phone, her voice a sharp, clinical instrument of war as she coordinated with her legal team and private security. "If a single hair on her head is touched, I will spend every penny of the Sterling Trust to burn that investigative firm to the ground," she hissed into the receiver before hanging up. She looked at Elias, her eyes reflecting the jagged neon of the city. We're 5 minutes out. They crossed a line, Elias said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the dashboard. You can come after me. You can sue me, lie about me, try to ruin me. But you don't go near my daughter. When they pulled up to the elementary school, the scene was already chaotic. Few local news vans had arrived, alerted by the same anonymous sources that had likely sent the investigators. 2 men in cheap suits and wraparound sunglasses stood near the main entrance, arguing with the school's lone security guard. Elias was out of the car before it had fully stopped. He didn't run, he marched. It was the purposeful, predatory stride of an apex predator. Serafina followed close behind, her white suit a beacon of cold authority against the grimy brick of the school building. Mr. Thorne, the principal, a harried woman named Mrs. Gable, cried out from the doorway. She was shielding Maya, who was tucked behind her skirts, looking small and terrified. One of the men in suits turned, holding up a manila envelope. Elias Thorne, we have a court-ordered subpoena for a deposition regarding Maya Thorne's living conditions, and Elias didn't let him finish. He was in the man's space in a heartbeat. He didn't strike him, but he loomed over him, his shadow swallowing the smaller man. The air around Elias seemed to drop 20 degrees. You are on school property, Elias said, his voice like grinding stones. You are harassing a minor. And if you don't turn around and walk to your car right now, I am going to forget that I'm a civilian. We have a right to. You have the right to remain silent, Serafina interrupted, stepping forward. She held up her phone, which was on a live video call. And you're currently being recorded by the chief of legal counsel for the Sterling Foundation. Claire. Gentlemen. Claire's voice rang out from the phone's speaker. I've already filed an emergency restraining order and a suit for trespassing and harassment. The NYPD is 2 minutes away. If you're still there when they arrive, you won't just be out of a job, you'll be in a cell. The 2 men looked at Elias, whose hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists, and then at the cold, scarred face of the most powerful heiress in the city. They didn't say another word. They turned and retreated to their sedan, tires chirping as they sped away from the curb. The silence that followed was broken by a small sob. Dad. Maya sprinted toward him. Elias dropped to his knees, catching her and burying his face in her hair. He was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer force of the restraint he'd had to exercise. I've got you, Maya. I've got you. You're safe. They said you were in trouble, Maya whispered into his neck. They said I had to go with them to help you. Elias's jaw tightened so hard it ached. He looked over Maya's shoulder at Serafina. She was standing there, her face a mask of sorrow and fury. In that moment, the gilded cage she had lived in wasn't just a metaphor. It was a weapon her family was using to beat the world into submission. We can't go back to the apartment, Serafina said softly. They know where you live. They know her school. My father is playing for blood, Elias. He wants to isolate you, to make you feel like a danger to your own child. I'm not a danger to her, Elias growled. I know that, but he'll spend millions to convince a judge otherwise. She stepped closer, reaching out to touch Maya's shoulder. We're going to my penthouse. It's a fortress, armed security, private elevators, and high enough that the shadows can't reach. It's time we stopped hiding in the Bronx and started fighting from the heights. The Sterling penthouse was a cathedral of glass, suspended 300 feet above the frantic pulse of Manhattan. For Maya, it was a fairyland, beds with silk sheets, a kitchen larger than their entire apartment, and windows that made the cars below look like glowing ants. But for Elias, it was a gilded cage. He paced the perimeter of the living room, his eyes scanning the skyline, his mind running through tactical contingencies. You're doing it again, Serafina said, leaning against the marble kitchen island. She had traded her blazer for a soft cashmere sweater, but the exhaustion was etched deep in her features. Doing what? Scanning for snipers. Looking for the exit. You're in a home, Elias. Not a forward operating base. My home is a 3-story walk-up with a leak in the bathroom, Elias replied, stopping his pace. This is a target. Your father knows exactly where we are. Good, she said, her voice turning cold. I want him to know. I want him to see that he can't scare me back into his version of a daughter. She walked over to him, taking his hands. Her palms were soft, a stark contrast to the calloused, scarred skin of his own. Elias, look at me. This isn't just about protecting you and Maya. It's about me finally taking back what's mine. I've spent 3 years being a ghost in this building. Tonight, I'm the owner. What's the next move? Elias asked. My father and Alistair Vance are meeting with the board tomorrow morning, she said. They're going to move to strip my voting rights and dissolve my oversight of the foundation. They're using this scandal of our relationship as proof of my instability. And we're going to crash the party. She smiled, and for a second, the scar on her cheek seemed to vanish beneath the sheer radiance of her defiance. Claire found something. Alistair Vance isn't just a bully. He's been funneling money out of his father's development funds to cover gambling debts in offshore accounts. My father knows about it. He's been helping him cover it up to ensure the Vance family stays loyal to the Sterling Group. Elias let out a low whistle. That's not just a scandal. That's a felony. It's leverage, Serafina corrected. And tomorrow, we're going to use it to break the cage once and for all. The boardroom of the Sterling Group was a cavern of mahogany and ego. Julian Sterling sat at the head of the table, flanked by a silent, stony-faced Eleanor and a smug Alistair Vance. The motion is simple, Julian was saying, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. In light of recent events, it is clear that Serafina is suffering from a prolonged psychological break. Her association with a man of questionable background and her public outbursts are a liability to the Sterling name. I couldn't agree more, Alistair added, leaning back. My family is prepared to forgive the assault, but only if the foundation is placed under Julian's direct control. We need stability. The board members, men and women who had grown fat on Sterling dividends, nodded. In unison, they were ready to sign away a woman's life for the sake of a stock price. Then, the heavy double doors at the end of the room swung open. Elias walked in first. He wasn't wearing a waiter's vest or a warehouse uniform. He was in a crisp black suit, his hair trimmed, his eyes like flint. He stood to the side of the door, his hands clasped behind his back, the silent, lethal sentinel. Then came Serafina. She wore a dress of sharp, obsidian silk. She didn't hide her face. She walked to the center of the room, her heels striking the floor like a drumbeat. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a queen coming to reclaim a stolen throne. The meeting hasn't started, Father, she said, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. Because the person with the largest share of voting stock hasn't arrived yet. Julian stood up, his face reddening. Serafina, you are not authorized to be here. Security. Security is currently downstairs, being served with a notice that their contracts have been transferred to my private firm, Serafina said, tossing a folder onto the table. She looked at the board members. Before you vote to declare me unfit, I suggest you look at the documents in front of you. They detail a series of wire transfers from the Vance Development Fund to a casino in Macau. They also detail the emails from my father's private server, authorizing the legal cover-up for those transfers. Alistair Vance's smug expression vanished, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor. Julian Sterling sank back into his chair, his eyes darting to the board. This is a lie, Eleanor Sterling whispered, her voice trembling. It's the truth, Serafina countered. And if this board votes against me today, these documents go to the SEC and the district attorney by noon. The Sterling Group will survive a scandal about my dating life. It will not survive a federal investigation into money laundering and corporate fraud. The room was deathly quiet. Elias watched the board members. He saw the moment. Their loyalty shifted. It wasn't about family or justice. It was about self-preservation. What do you want, Serafina? Julian asked, his voice suddenly old and hollow. I want a total severance, she said. I want the foundation and all its assets transferred to a private trust under my sole control. I want the penthouse and the Sterling name cleared of any claim by this board. And in exchange, I'll let you and Alistair resign quietly for health reasons before the authorities get involved. She looked at her mother. And I want you to stay away from Maya. If I ever see a private investigator near that little girl again, I won't use a lawyer. I'll use the man standing by the door. Elias met Eleanor's eyes. He didn't say a word, but the promise of violence in his gaze was enough to make her look away. Vote, Serafina commanded. One by one, the hands went up. It was unanimous. The gilded cage had been unlatched. That evening, they stood on the balcony of the penthouse. The city was a carpet of light, beautiful and indifferent. Maya was inside, curled up on a velvet sofa, fast asleep with a picture book in her lap. For the first time in 10 years, Elias felt like he could breathe without checking the wind for smoke. You did it, he said, leaning his elbows on the railing. We did it, Serafina corrected. She turned to him, the wind ruffling her hair. The scar was there, clear and bold in the moonlight. I don't have a family anymore, Elias. Not in the way I used to. I've walked away from the only world I've ever known. The world you knew was a prison, Serafina. You were just the only one who realized the bars were made of gold. She stepped into his space, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. I'm a private citizen now. No board, no sterling group, just me, and a foundation that actually does some good. And a security chief who's still a terrible dancer, Elias reminded her. Serafina laughed, and it was a sound of pure, unadulterated freedom. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I think I can live with that. She looked at the city, then back at him. You saved me, Elias. Twice. Once at the gala, and once today by showing me that I was worth fighting for. Andrew saved me so I could be here for you, Elias said softly. It's a debt I'm happy to spend the rest of my life paying. As they stood there, suspended between the stars and the street, Elias Thorne finally let go of the war. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep promise of a future that wasn't built on shadows or greed, but on the simple, unbreakable strength of two people who had found their way out of the dark. The cage was broken. The hero was home. And for the first time, the sterling heiress and the soldier were exactly who they wanted to be, just Serafina and Elias. The victory in the Sterling Group boardroom had been a surgical strike, but as Elias Thorne had learned in the dust of distant valleys, winning the battle was rarely the same thing as winning the peace. The gilded cage had been shattered, but the glass still lay on the floor, and the world they were building now had to be constructed with hands that were still healing. 6 months had passed since Serafina had walked away from her father's empire. The morning light in their new home, a spacious, sun-drenched brownstone inn, Brooklyn Heights, was soft and amber, filtered through the leaves of the ancient oaks lining the street. It was a house that breathed. It didn't have the sterile, pressurized silence of the Sterling penthouse or the rattling, cramped anxiety of the Bronx walk-up. It was a middle ground, a place where Maya had a room with a window seat and Elias had a kitchen where he didn't bump his elbows. On the sink, Elias stood at the stove, the familiar weight of the cast iron griddle in his hand. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and sweatpants, his feet bare on the warm wood floor. He looked younger. The hard, hyper-vigilant edges of his face had softened, though the stillness of the soldier remained, a quiet strength that now served as the foundation of their home. Is the batter resting, Dad? Maya asked, skipping into the kitchen. She was wearing a t-shirt that said future geologist, and her hair was tied back in a neat braid, a skill Serafina had patiently taught her. 5 minutes, just like the Thorne family manual dictates, Elias said, checking his watch. Resting batter makes for fluffier pancakes. It's science. Maya. It's deliciousness, a voice corrected from the doorway. Elias turned, his heart doing that familiar, rhythmic skip it only did for one person. Serafina stood there, leaning against the frame. She was wearing one of Elias's old flannel shirts over leggings, her face scrubbed clean of makeup. Her dark hair was loose, and the jagged silver scar on her cheek was fully visible, catching the morning light. She didn't look like a tragic heiress or a corporate titan. She looked like a woman who was finally, truly home. Good morning, she said, walking over to Elias. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed his jaw. Morning, he murmured, his hand finding the small of her back. How was the late-night session? The Andrew Sterling Foundation is officially a private entity as of midnight, she said, her voice filled with a quiet, hard-won pride. The last of the Sterling Group's oversight has been severed. We're independent, Elias. Truly independent. That deserves extra chocolate chips, Maya announced, climbing into her chair. As the pancakes hit the griddle, the conversation flowed with the ease of a river that had finally found its bed. They talked about Maya's upcoming science fair, the new veteran outreach center they were opening in Queens, and the mundane details of a life lived without shadows. But beneath the domestic bliss, the work of building a future beyond the scars continued. Later that afternoon, after Maya had gone to a friend's house, Elias and Serafina sat in the small home office they shared. On the desk lay a battered wooden box, the one containing Captain Andrew Sterling's medals and letters. I had a meeting with the board of the Outreach Center yesterday, Elias said, leaning back in his chair. We have 22 veterans signed up for the first vocational training cycle. Most of them are guys like me, good at the job, but invisible to the world. Serafina reached out and touched the Purple Heart medal in the box. My father called me yesterday from the house in Florida. Elias went still. And he sounded small, she said, her eyes distant. The Vance lawsuit settlement took a lot out of him. Not just the money, but the reputation. He asked if I'd consider coming back to the Sterling Group in a consultant role. He said he was willing to overlook our living situation. Elias waited. He didn't tell her what to do. He didn't try to protect her from her own family anymore. He knew she didn't need a protector. She needed a partner. I told him that the only thing he should be overlooking is the Atlantic Ocean. Serafina said, a sharp, defiant smile touching her lips. I told him that I am no longer a Sterling of the group. I am just Serafina, and that if he wanted to see me, he would have to come to the Bronx Outreach Center and volunteer his time clearing out the old files. What did he say? He hung up. She let out a breath, a weight leaving her shoulders. It didn't hurt, Elias. For the first time in my life, his disappointment didn't feel like a cage. It felt like background noise. Elias stood up and walked around the desk, pulling her into his arms. That's because you've outgrown the cage, Serafina. You're flying now. The final hurdle of their journey came a month later, at the official opening of the Captain Andrew Sterling Veteran Center. It wasn't a gala. There were no crystal chandeliers or $5,000 dresses. It was a renovated warehouse, bright, clean, and filled with the smell of fresh paint and hope. The guests were men and women in work boots and flannel shirts, veterans and their families who had finally found a place where they weren't liabilities or scandals. Serafina stood on the small wooden stage, looking out at the crowd. She wasn't hiding behind her hair. She hadn't used concealer to dim the jagged line on her face. She stood before the cameras and the crowd, and she looked beautiful, not despite the scar, but because of it. My uncle, Captain Andrew Sterling, believed that no one is left behind, she told the audience, her voice steady and clear. For a long time, I thought that only applied to the battlefield. I thought that in the world of wealth and business, being left behind was just the cost of doing business. But I was wrong. She looked at Elias, who was standing in the front row, holding Maya's hand. I was saved by a man who reminded me that our scars are not our ending, she continued. They are the place where our strength begins. This center isn't about charity. It's about community. It's about building a future where no one has to hide their wounds to be seen as a human being. The applause that followed was loud, messy, and real. It wasn't the polite, performative clapping of the Grand Hotel. It was the sound of people who felt seen. As the sun set over Brooklyn that evening, Elias and Serafina stood on the roof of the center, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. The glass towers glittered in the distance, but they looked different now, less like fortresses and more like just buildings. You okay? Elias asked, sensing her quietness. I was just thinking about the gala, she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. The night you grabbed Alistair's shoulder. It feels like a lifetime ago. In a way it was, Elias said. We're different people now. Are we? She turned to him, her eyes searching his. You're still the man who stands his ground, and I'm still the girl who needs to be reminded to breathe. No, Elias said, turning her to face him. You're the woman who broke a billion-dollar cage, and I'm just a guy who's very lucky to be by your side. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old, yellowed handkerchief, the one with the initials yes he had carried for a decade. He looked at it for a long time, then handed it to her. I don't think I need to carry this anymore, Elias said softly. The debt is paid, Serafina. Andrew saved me so I could help you find your way back. And you saved me by giving me a reason to stop just surviving. Serafina took the cloth, her fingers tracing the embroidered initials. She didn't put it in a box. She tucked it into the pocket of her coat, close to her heart. We built it, Elias, she whispered, looking at the center beneath them and the life they had made. A future beyond the scars. And it's beautiful, he replied. The war was over. The echoes of the forgotten hero had been answered by the actions of the living. And as Elias Thorne leaned down to kiss Serafina, the Bronx soldier and the sterling heiress were no longer defined by what they had lost, but by what they had found in each other. The world was still loud, and the shadows would always try to creep back in. But as they walked back downstairs to join Maya and the others, Elias knew they were ready, because they didn't have gold or crystal to protect them anymore. They had something much stronger. They had the truth. They had each other. And they had next Sunday's pancakes to look forward to.